The talk will have 5 parts. The first part will introduce what is that UG problem. Then I'll discuss a few types of solutions to this problem. And the third part will be looking at let's say, the stellar example of what UG represents, and that is structure dependence and polar interrogatives, which has been going on for a good 50 years. I will then look at structure dependence and the facts in more detail to show that there are still things to complete there. And finally, I'll sum up with a different explanation of the facts, which will have for consequence that appeal to UG, as is usually done, will not be necessary, and we'll see that that's a good thing. So, what is the UG problem? As we were just told, and Chomsky reminded us in 2005, properties of language are determined by 3 factors. There's the genetic endowment, and this is the topic of universal grammar. There's personal experience, whatever we're exposed to. And finally, there are principles that are language or even organism independent, computational efficiency being the one that is most usually appealed to, but also the substances of language, I'd rather call them, which is the properties of the interfaces. And as Chomsky says, UG is the residue when the third factor effects are abstracted. And the problem is, the richer the residue, the harder it will be to account for the evolution of UG. So, since UG presents a problem, why introduce it? Well, of course, we all know that it's historically for reasons of acquisition, to try to explain acquisition. I'll go over the argument very briefly because we all know about it. Children master the complex system of language quickly and uniformly. Many generalizations seem impossible to learn from primary linguistic data because they would require negative data. This is the poverty of stimulus argument. That is, children seem to know more about language than what they could learn from their experience. UG constraints are not learned by hypothesis. They are in our genetic endowment. Therefore, they solve the problem in the sense that children cannot err outside the path traced by these UG properties. They only choose among the options provided by UG. That's more or less the traditional view for at least the last 50 years. As we can gather from Chomsky's quote, UG is the list of things that are unexplained in the theory and directly relevant to this conference. The more complex UG is, the more likely its evolution will be. So that's the problem we have to solve, because the enrichment of UG to account for the data descriptively weakens the explanatory value of the model because of simplicity considerations. We're making the theory more complex, and also we're not appealing to external motivation anymore, what Chomsky refers to as the third factor. And of course, this all makes it harder to account for its evolution. So in a way, UG must go. It's a temporary solution to problems, we hope. Or at least it must be substantially reduced. And scholars have been looking for alternative solutions. There are 2 types of solutions to UG. When I say 2, I'm grossly simplifying, but it's just to go through things quickly. The first one is to use other cognitive processes to reduce or totally eliminate UG. And the second one is to use general principles of natural law, particularly considerations of minimal computation. Now, in the first case, when you use other cognitive processes, again, I'm simplifying enormously, but some will use statistical analysis, communication function, social context of normal use, and so on. And you have a wrap-up of this, a summary of this in Perforce et al. 2011. Others will say that the learning capacity is better than asserted. Ellman has been proposing this for many years, and there are lots of things written on that. And a third solution will be to say something like, the available data is actually richer than what we think. That's the position of Pullum and Schultz, for example, in 2002. But those results are rather unconvincing when you look at the data in detail, and this has been summarized in Berwick et al. 2011 and Chomsky 2011. So the first position though there are a few things there, on the whole are not very successful. The second position is the one that was alluded to in the introduction, to appeal to design features, to minimal computation in particular. But when you look at it in detail, and I'll look at one example in a moment, this requires much more UG enrichment than is explicitly recognized, and it fails empirically even in the wildest cases. And I will look at a very wild case, and we'll see that it actually fails. But fortunately, there's a third type of solution based on, again, what I call the substances of language, and what you might want to call the interfaces. So let's look, to illustrate all this, at the stellar example of a UG constraint, structure dependence and polar interrogatives. As you all know, it's contrasts as in one that illustrate this: the man is happy, is the man happy? How do you relate these two sentences? How do children learn the formation of polar interrogatives? As Chomsky very early on indicated, and still does 50 years later, you have at least two basic options. Those are in A and B. You can have a linear option which says front the first occurrence of is, or you can have a more structurally a rule which says front the structurally most prominent occurrence of is. And of course, there are other possibilities. Move an occurrence of is to the front of the sentence, any occurrence, or move the last occurrence to the front of the sentence, and so on. Okay. And the problem is, if you go through the data with this very simple schema of rules in mind, well, the only one that even just a few simple sentences like those in 2 and 3, the only case that really works for those simple examples is structure dependence, the rule B, if you want. It's the only one that gets all the correct results and none of the bad results. I won't go through that because it's quite familiar and easy to see. Okay. Now, this raises two questions. I had written immediately initially and removed it because it took a while, but they should have been raised immediately, I think. Why is the rule dependent on structure and not linearity? Okay. And why is tense the fronted element in polar interrogatives, not some other element? Okay. So let's look at the answers to these two questions. So why structure dependence and not linear dependence? Well, traditionally it was simply said, well, it's a fact. We see that, and we just put it in UG. Okay. Now, Chomsky recently has tried to go a bit further than that, and to say that we can maybe go beyond a simple description here. He says, suppose linearization is never required for interpretation in semantics. Then we would expect it to be introduced solely as a reflex of the sensory motor apparatus. Okay. So he said, linear order is simply not available to the computational system at the point where the comp-tense relation is established. So therefore, since it's not available, that's why you don't have linear rules. You have structural rules instead. Now, without going into much detail, some facts are problematic for the assumption that linearization is never required for interpretation in semantics. Just to give one old example brought up by Wassow in 1979 for his novelty condition. The condition goes, an anaphorically dependent element cannot have more determinate reference than its antecedent, and he looks at sentences where linear order is important. So, for example, you can say naturally in English, a doctor walked into the room, the man at first said nothing. It's very odd, on the other hand, to say a man walked into the room, the doctor at first said nothing, meaning the doctor is the man. And sentences of that type, many examples are found in Wassow. So right there seems to be something going on in linearization. Linear order of tense is involved at some point. Okay, how do we know it's not involved all along? Can the computational system process a word or a phrase without its linear properties? I know it's assumed by many, but if we think about it, a sign, a word, or a complex sign, a phrase, is a link between a meaning and a form. A word is defined in part by its phonological substance, including the order of its phonemes. If you remove that, you have a meaning of some sort. You don't have a word. You only have a word when you have a link between the two. So the whole of its phonological content is ordered with respect to the phonological content of the other words in the derivation all along. You can always say you will forget it temporarily in the derivation, but then you'll have come back to it at some point. So where is it in limbo during the time you're forgetting about it? So on the whole, I think that we do not have an explanation for structure dependence over dependence on linearity, because both are involved in the process. So choosing between the two is not an obvious option. So let's say that for now we don't have an answer to the first question. Okay, it's just a speculation that no one brings up to say that linear order is not available to the computational system at the point where the comp-tense relation is established. But it's no more than that for now, at least. Okay. Now, what about tense? Why is tense, and particularly the tense of the main clause, why is it that element that moves to comp and not some other element, such as in this example from Chomsky, why not the subject, for example, or any other element in the sentence? Now, assuming computational efficiency, as he does and as the tradition of looking into this problem does, a particular locality, well, it has to be that tense is structurally closest to comp, and that's why it's the one that moves. But the problem is that the subject is at least as close to comp as tense. So Chomsky's proposal is to say, well, the subject is not there when tense and comp are related, so therefore it's really tense that's the closest. How does he achieve that? He says the subject is initially generated internally to VP and is raised after tense moves to comp. So if we look at this structurally, this is what you would have in basic structure, sort of. Okay. So at this point, the subject is deep below, and can is therefore the tense element the closest to comp. Okay. And if you had moved the subject first and raised it, then you're stuck, okay, because can is not the closest element. But if you assume that the subject is still down there when can moves, then you're fine, because you can simply say locality saves the day because can was the closest, and that's why it's the element that moved. Now, there's several implicit assumptions here. If we try to replicate the experiment, that is to do the derivation as neutrally as possible, we realize that there are several implicit assumptions in this analysis for which there are no evident principled explanations right now, and we're looking for principled explanations all along. I'll look at 4 simple implicit assumptions here. The first one is that something must move in C when a sentence is a polar interrogative. Why is that? Okay. The second one is that T moves to C before the subject and P moves to the T position. I know it saves the day if you assume that, but why assume that? This is an ordering of transformations. For some of us, it's, who remember those days past, it's going back to a long, long time ago to order transformations in a derivation. Another thing you have to assume is that CP is a phase, but not TP. More generally, if we forget the details here, whenever you talk about minimal distance in a structure, you're going to have to specify what counts as a barrier node. Can you derive that, or do you have to put it in UG? And another element which Chomsky does point out briefly at some point is that this VP sister of T in the structure is as close to C as T is, but only T moves. If you look at the structure again, the T and the VP are equally close to comp. So why is it can that moves? Okay. Now we all know that intuitively it would not make sense for some reason for things to go otherwise. But why is it that? Okay. Now we could say that these are just these 4 assumptions are just details to be worked out in Chomsky's newly proposed analysis. The problem is if we keep on looking at the derivation, if we try to reproduce the experiment again, there are 4 other implicit constraints that have been present in arguments for structure dependence for some 50 years. So it's not a problem of one new analysis coming up. These have been there for a long, long time, so we have to deal with them. The first constraint is that the rule targets the tense of the sentence. Why is that? We still don't have an answer. Without constraint 1, the learner could erroneously assume that you move any element at all to form a question. Okay, you have a first occurrence where you see a movement produced a question. You say, oh, okay, if I move something, I get a question. No, it has to be a particular element. Why is that? Okay. The second constraint is that the tensed element ends up in a particular position outside of the basic sentence. Without this constraint, the child could make the error of moving tense to any other position in the structure. Why does it go to that position? Now, this could be attributed, as it has been since Baker, 1970 at least, Lee Baker. This can be attributed to the presence of a cue marker on comp that attracts tense to check it. But as many have said, including Chomsky, this is just a restatement of the basic property. It's not a true explanation. It pushes the stipulation deeper into the system, but it does not dispose of it, so we're still stipulating this. The third constraint is that the phenomena is restricted to main clauses. Okay? Without three, the embedded tense could be targeted and fronted to the embedded comp or to the main clause, and this would be a perfectly okay structure, but we don't get that. Okay? And finally, the fourth constraint is that the special order correlates with a question meaning. Why is that? Okay? Without four, the child could just play with the rule with no change in meaning. But of course, that's not what happens. So these constraints have to be stipulated, we'd say listed in UG, with no change, because they follow from nothing, basically. Okay, there's no principled reason for why things, in a movement analysis at least, why things happen the way they do. So structure dependence is not independently motivated. There's no reason to choose that over linear and to have a constraint at all, other than descriptive reasons for now. And it's not sufficient. We need at least these constraints. So the key question actually is not answered yet. The question being, why does tense appear in comp in polar interrogatives? Second part of the problem is the empirical side. Okay? We see that there's no conceptual deep motivation for structure dependence. Let's look at the facts. Does it account for the facts? Okay. Not only does structure dependence necessitates several additional implicit stipulations, as I just saw, it also fails empirically, even in the wildest cases. Okay. Let's take a very wild case. No human language, to my knowledge, forms questions by linearly reversing the word order of a declarative. Okay. Well, it's very easy to do, even if you assume structure dependence. Take a common assumption. An interrogative sentence like 1b has a cue marker in comp that attracts the tensed verb. Take a fact. The sentence also has a specific interrogative intonation. At least in many languages this happens. Take another fairly common assumption. This intonation is the question intonation is anchored in comp with a cue marker, and it spreads over the structure. Kegel et al. Say that it even takes place in sign languages. And then what could happen? Well, a child could make the natural analogy that the cue features that spread intonation on every constituent can also trigger movement of those constituents. Okay? Dominique Sportiche in 1995, looking at strictly intonational questions in French, made exactly that proposal. He said, you get the intonation because it spreads from comp, but that same feature triggers a movement of the whole sentence in front of the final sentence intonational marker. So you could have these features playing a double role, both on the intonation side of things and on the movement side of things. Okay? So let's take a simple example. Assume, therefore, that you have the sentence, John took the money, and that it has an initial comp with a cue feature, and that the cue features spread over each constituent and word. So John has a cue, took has a cue, Deb has a cue, and money has a cue. So you start your derivation. Well, money, the lowest element in the structure, has a cue feature. So it raises above the determiner, checks its cue feature, and also checks the cue feature, the determiner, and these are eliminated. So now we're left with only the cue feature of the determiner phrase. The determiner phrase, now in the order money, the, has a Q feature. So it raises above the verb somewhere. Where, I mean, it's very easy to invent where. I won't go into details, it's not necessary. But this Q feature of this element is checked against the Q feature of the verb. They're both eliminated. And now we are left with the Q feature of the VP, or whichever constituent is the result of money, the, moving there. Now this constituent, money, the, took, still has a Q feature to be checked. It raises somewhere above John, and the Q feature of this constituent and the Q feature of John are checked. And at the end of the derivation, the only Q feature left is the one in comp, and that's fantastic because that's the one that's interpreted. And you get the result, money, the, took, John, the reversal of the order. So even with structure dependence and with the addition of the 4 constraints I gave above, common analytical tools can derive constructions that are impossible in any language. Structure dependence restricts how children can invert the order of words, but it does not prevent children from inverting the order as in 8 or other fantastic cases like that. Just about anything is possible under those assumptions. I'll just give a few very brief examples. Suppose you find a language there where the subject is fronted instead of tense. Okay? Well, you could say this demonstrates that constraint 1 is parameterized between tense and subject as a Q feature checker. So it's not tense that moves because it doesn't have the Q feature in this language. It's a subject that has the Q feature. So it's the one that will move. Or take another case, hypothetical again. Tense moves to a position other than comp. What do you do with that? Well, you say there's a parameterized landing site here, or there's a parameterized overt versus covert movement of tense to comp here in this particular language, and that's it, the problem solved. Suppose tense moves out of the embedded clause. Well, you'd say this language has different escape hatches, or it has something along what you find in long head movement in some Balkan languages, or you could appeal to minimalized relativity, okay, so that it's the element downstairs that has the Q feature. Well, that's the element that's going to move to the top sentence because no such element is in the main sentence in that particular language. It's very easy to find cases like that and to find a solution for them. All of this and much more is possible actually in the movement analysis, because these constraints, that is structure dependence and the 4 constraints I gave, are random facts, which therefore could be replaced by other random constraints in UG or parameter values in particular languages. There's no principled reason to choose among them. That's precisely why we list them in UG. Okay? Another indication that there's a problem here is that tense is not targeted because it's the most prominent element. Okay? If you look at languages where instead of movement or intonation, you have a question particle in that language, you most of the time find that question particle where? On the tense-bearing element. For example, in Quebec French, there's a particle pronounced tu, like the pronoun, but it's not at all a pronoun, which you find immediately attached after the first element that bears the tense of the main clause. Okay? You find similar things in Japanese and Korean and many other languages. So, Paul, as-tu fini? A is the auxiliary that bears tense. Well, the tu appears on the A. Je fais-tu ça correctement? Fait is the main verb. It's the one that bears the tense here, so the tu attaches to that one. Okay? So particle marking shows that tense is not targeted for linear or hierarchical proximity to comp. Tense is targeted because of its meaning. We have to do something to tense in a polar interrogative. Okay? So I now turn to a tentative explanation based on substantive properties instead of listing things in UG. There's a third type of solution to the problem of language acquisition. Now, all the usual solutions, and really even those that are almost ferociously opposed to the movement analysis, they all, on the other hand, assume that the original description of what is going on in pairs like I had in 1A and 1B, that is a fact. And they just try to explain it differently. So almost everyone assumes that a transformation moves something. Okay? It may well be that what movement analyses claim that children know requires many domain-specific devices like those listed in UG, like those I gave that you need in addition to structure dependence. But that is irrelevant, I say, because that is not what children know. By the context of use, children are exposed not only to the order difference between 1A and 1B, but also to the difference in meaning. Children do not learn that things move around. Children learn that different orders come with different meanings. Okay? So what do children realize in comparing 1A and 1B? They realize that the tense auxiliary is, and this is for this specific example, tense in general, that is, can appear in two different positions, and that the meanings of the two resulting sentences are different. That's a very basic observation. Okay? Now, that is a very common learning situation in language, especially a language like English where word order is heavily grammatical. Okay? As in 1A and 1B, the correlation in 10 is also very systematic. If John is in position A, it's compositionally interpreted as the one who sees. If it's in position B, John is compositionally interpreted as the seen one. Okay? Now, how is tense compositionally interpreted in 1A and 1B? I think it's in the same way as what we find in the John and saw Mary example. So in order to figure that out, what is taking place when tense is involved, we have to look at the key elements that are involved, each of which has a conceptual semantic substance side of things and a perceptual syntactic substance side of things. What are the two elements involved? Well, tense, of course, and the other element is the rest of the sentence. Okay? So what are both the meaning aspect of these two elements and the form aspect of these two elements? Let's start with tense. What is the tense here? Well, it's the deictic tense. It's the tense of the main clause that is determined with respect to the moment of speech. Okay? Note, by the way, that this is some kind of curious fossil that we have in natural languages. It's a typical property of main sentences in virtually all languages, I think, that they are obligatorily tied to our indexical system of immediate experience by means of a deictic element. Now, we always talk, and there will be, of course, a lot of talk about this in this conference, how displaced we are to use terms that are commonly used. When we use language, we can talk about anything at any time, even hypothetical things and so on. So it's totally removed from the immediate compared to animal calls, which are always tied to the immediate. And yet, at the very heart of every sentence, we have something that ties us to the immediate. So there's a curious fossil there. I close the parenthesis because that's not the subject of my talk today. So the conceptual semantic substance of tense is really this deicticity of the main tense of the sentence. What about the perceptual syntactic substance? What's its form? Okay. Well, typically in English, it's a morphological marker on a verb at the head of the sentence. Okay. That's why people put tense at the head of the sentence, typically. What about the rest of the sentence? What is its meaning, at least relevant to what we're discussing here? We could call it the issue, okay, about which we must make a judgment, using the term from Ladouceur 1996, who introduced this notion in a discussion of negation and negative polarity items. What's the issue? It's the description of a class of events by the main predication of the sentence. Okay, it's the thing you're talking about. And what's the perceptual side of this issue? How is it expressed? In what kind of form? Well, its form is the words combined in the verb phrase and the subject. Okay? So it's split for some strange reason. Why is that? Very briefly, the issue is split in syntax because the issue is a network of relationships between actants, to take a very general term, whereas tense identifies a point in time. Okay? So they are ontologically different. You have a network of elements on the one hand, and you have a point, and you have to try to relate them in some way. Well, issue and tense are related indirectly through one of the actants. That's what is called the subject. So by taking one of the arguments in this network of elements, you now have a point. You put it in relationship with tense, and indirectly you situate the whole network. So that's why the issue is split in two elements in the syntax. Okay, the subject being the special element in this case. Now, if the syntactic counterpart of the issue is placed under the immediate scope of the deictic tense, we get a positive judgment, an affirmative declarative. Okay? And there's been a lot of discussion of the semantics of this. More philosophically inclined people will say that it is by situating it in time, that's how you can give it a value of some sort, a truth value of some sort. Okay? But that gives you the declarative sentence. Now, what happens when the deictic tense is expressed outside of the syntactic counterpart of the issue, as we find in sentences like 1b, when the is in comp, not in its usual position inside the sentence? Well, the issue is then presented as being separated from tense, as not being established. Well, this induces a polar interrogative interpretation, a request to know whether the issue should be considered established or not. So now we look at why are the properties described in the constraints all interrelated, the four constraints I named earlier on? Well, tense is involved because of its relation with the issue. There's a semantic thing going on between these two elements. Tense is in comp because in that position it establishes a particular semantic relation with the issue. The tense of the main clause is involved because the issue is a matter of the utterance of the main predication of the whole sentence. And finally, the interpretation results in a polar interrogative meaning because combining tense from outside with the issue presents the issue as not being established. Now, together, these properties have the effect that in a displacement analysis, the movement of tense appears structure dependent, but this is an illusion. Question formation is not structure dependent, it's not linear dependent, it's meaning dependent. Okay? The whole thing is to establish a particular meaning holding between tense and the rest of the sentence, with the issue, if you want. So to summarize, what learners realize when exposed to 1a and 1b, or any similar pair, is that if tense is in a syntactic sentence internal position, it is interpreted as establishing the issue with respect to deictic time. It's the kind of thing that we have to do constantly in languages to figure out, like in the John saw Mary example. Okay, it's just that the elements here are tense and issue. It's their correlation we're looking at. If tense is in a position external to the issue, it's interpreted as not establishing the issue. As with signs in general, learners expect that a difference in form will correspond to a difference in meaning, and vice versa. A difference in meaning will be expressed by a difference in form, a very basic element. Learners will need very rich positive evidence before they use a different word order, such as a meaning difference, just as they learn other position-meaning correlations. For example, the order of the phonemes of a lexical item, the order of arguments, the pre- and post-nominal adjectives in French, and countless many orders that we find. Now, there's no reason why children would make blunt order errors by analogy like the ones mentioned at the beginning of the talk, since moving things around linearly or structurally is not at all analogous to what they do. The primary linguistic data is saturated with information germane to acquiring what is really going on in polar interrogatives: order, meaning correlations, form, meaning links, signs in general. Okay? The fact that there's an alternative to this classical appeal to UG, structure dependence, is good news. It means that we can drop that problematic expedient. Okay? And in conclusion, just as the design properties of biological systems emerge from local physical interactions of components and are not imposed on nature by some external force, the constraints found in language emerge from interactions among properties of the building materials of science, not from UG conditions imposed from outside by linguists. As a send-off, conditions based on sensory motor and conceptual intentional factors also account for the restrictions on other well-known constructions. Of course, each of these would be the subject of another talk. I just mentioned three here briefly. Islands, of course, starting with the seminal work of Urtashik-Shir in '73. I've done quite a lot of work on this. Jabolsky and then Dicken did quite a lot also. Islands are explained by these kinds of factors and not simply described. Okay. Binding conditions, I've done some work on that, particularly on binding condition C. You can get rid of binding condition C because if you look at the facts differently, it follows that things must be interpreted in that way. Again, it's another talk. Negative polarity item, there's a very nice paper by Janet Kidu who shows that, well, if you look at the meaning of these elements, you don't need structure-dependent conditions of some sort. The meaning just explains exactly what is going on. So I think this is a general way of looking at things, which is, what Chomsky calls the third factor is something that has been talked about for many, many years. Any basic epistemological book will tell you that the ideal explanation, what he calls a principled explanation, is based on something which is prior to the object of study that you're looking at. Okay? My favorite is Lakatos in his 1970 long paper, who gives many examples where things that are central problems in a science will be taken as the basics for another science, temporarily at least. They'll be considered as observational propositions instead of deep analytical propositions. So for example, if I say, astrophysicists saw a new galaxy yesterday with their radio telescopes, well, of course, they didn't see anything. The radio telescope, all the science that's behind it, they take it temporarily as working properly. Okay? And if ever there's some problem with the science that they have and what seems to be going on in that distant galaxy, they'll try to figure out what's wrong with their science, what's wrong with their description of their galaxy, and eventually maybe they'll figure out there's something wrong with our radio telescope, and they'll go and see the guys who work on the science of the radio telescope. Okay? Well, we do the same thing in linguistics. Okay? When we say, for example, that things occur linearly in oral languages, well, that's generally the case, but not absolutely. Okay? I'll talk about that tomorrow. And that's simply due to the fact that we have a certain articulatory system that cannot produce two words at the same time because of the way it's made up. Whereas if you're in a sign language, there are some things that you can produce simultaneously because you have a set of articulators that allow that. Okay? Well, that's part of the modality. Therefore, you don't want to put into the system too many things that depend on restrictions due to the articulatory system. Okay? That's Saussure's linearity principle. It goes back to at least a century. Okay. And when Kane, for example, tries to explain with his LCA some structural properties based on the fact that you can't pronounce two words at the same time, or if you want that they have to be linearized, Tenière, a Saussurian, already had done that in the 50s. Okay. It's not a reproach to Kane, it's just an observation. So it's clear that there are things that you can derive from these much more basic properties. Okay. Now, these very basic properties of the interfaces are there. Okay? And we agree mostly on these properties, except for some very minor details. So they should be the basis of explanation before appealing to anything like UG. UG, again, is just a temporary expedient when we don't understand something, and we just list it there temporarily. But we want to find an explanation for it. I think there's a way to find explanations for just about every case where we use UG. And that's a good solution. Why? Well, as pointed out at the very beginning, especially in the context of this conference, Evolon, okay, if you have a very complex UG with a lot of things specified, the more complex it is, the harder it will be to explain its evolution. Okay? If you say if you manage to show that you don't need it, then you're on a right path, I think. And this is a small indication that I think we can get on the right path. I took an example that's been discussed for some 50 years, and I think having really not made much progress in 50 years by looking at it from a movement computational perspective, it might be an indication, A, that you were on the right track all along, or B, that you were on the wrong track all along, and that's why you didn't make much progress. I think it's about time to consider the second option and to try to look at different kinds of explanations. Thank you.
Okay, we will have about 20 minutes to accept questions and comments. And we will have standing microphones over there, so you can proceed to those microphones. And also, maybe there are some microphones running around. Right? Okay, so please address your name, affiliation before you ask questions.
Cedric was asking a question about the talk. I have mixed feelings about it. I like the first part very much because I think you managed to show that there are indeed many more assumptions that are typically inserted in even third factor principal explanations. But then the more negative feelings I have pertain to the second part of the talk. Because I think that there are at least as many assumptions that you have to build in under the concept of capital meaning. So, for example, there will be things that you'll have to tell us about how a child can identify tense elements. There will be things you'll have to tell us about how the child comes up with the notion of capital issue, right? These don't necessarily come for free, especially given the fact that not only do we have a particular syntax that no other animal seems to have, but we also seem to have a conceptual system that's far richer than other species. And a lot of people have been trying to link the two, namely say that it's because of the structure that we have the conceptual structure that we have, and that these are not independent. And if you go in that direction, then I think a lot of what falls under the rubric of capital meaning fall under the rubric of capital UG. And so really we are appealing to different, maybe primitives or not so primitives of UG, but I don't think that we have moved outside of the realm of things that people have considered for 50 years. And I'm wondering if you could address that.
Yeah, you are right if we analyzed the possibility of having capital issue that have that kind of structurally organized meaning, if we think that it depends on the syntactic possibilities of human language. I think that we have that independently of that aspect of things. I'll talk about it a bit tomorrow, so I won't get into it too much today. But that's, you're right. I mean, in order to complete the argument, I have to show that the way this issue notion comes about is really strictly a meaning, cognitive, conceptual thing that is particular to humans, but not dependent on the particular structural aspect of language that we have in humans, that they're independent one from another on the one hand, and that the meaning aspect of things is prior to the other one. Okay? I fully agree with you, but I think it can be done, and actually I think I have done it already. Not in this talk, but I have done it. But you're right, it has to be completed in that way. As for the tense, I think that it's something that we all have to deal with. That is, this notion is a very primitive conceptual notion. It is dealt with in a particular way. There's this fossil aspect to it that I pointed out. So we have to look in that, investigate that in detail. But again, it's a meaning cognitive issue thing here that I think will solve that problem and explain it.
Can I just add a little note to that? I mean, fair point. I mean, you know, so to complete the argument, I grant you that, you know, that could be done. Don't skeptical. But with tense specifically, what has to be shown, though, is not so much that with the conceptual primitive tense, but also the conceptual primitive that enters the syntax in the particular way that it does in human languages, right? It's not going to be enough to just say that we have a notion deixis or time, for example, at the conceptual level, but also that it's realized as tense in natural languages. That's typically harder to show.
What I call this relationship of tense with the rest of the sentences, I said, tense is the anchor. And then we can get a bit philosophical. It's the anchor in the sense that you have this issue, which is a very broad propositional description of a potential event. And the only way to realize a actual event, let's say, is to situate it deictically in some way. And that's what tense comes and does. Notice, by the way, that though tense is overwhelmingly the deictic anchor of sentences and languages of the world, there are some languages where the deictic anchor is either person in some languages or place in other languages. There's been work by Ritter and Vilchko on that in languages in the west coast of Canada where the deictic anchor is different. But what's interesting, it seems, as far as I know anyhow, we have never found a language that doesn't have a deictic anchor for its sentences. And I don't think that's part of syntax. What syntax does there, okay, is provide means to associate this deictic anchor with the rest of the sentence. But the profound primitive is that we seem to have this fossil in us that requires that we have deictic anchoring. Okay, that's what I would base it on.
Hi, Massimo. Look, I'm always perplexed when something in syntax is explained through something else, be it semantics, conceptual things. Because there are so many things in syntax that are at odds with conceptual things. I mention some tomorrow in my talk. But look, take for instance the fact that verbs are associated with their objects much more intimately than they are associated with the agent. You know, that is not something that comes conceptually. As a datum, it is a syntactic thing. I'm very much in favor of the economy of syntax. And where there are a number of other phenomena, take all the complexity of the left periphery. We have very bizarre things in the left periphery that do not match our conceptual thing, that something is habitual. Habitual dominates volition, you know, and things like that. Or another example is the conservativity of the terminus of natural languages, of all the possible relations between sets. The terminus in natural language should choose something which is less than 1% of all the possible relations between sets. That is a language universal. So, first of all, I think that there are things in syntax that are in syntax and then are thought, in language expressed thought, we have to obey syntax. You know, there is no escape from syntax, we have to obey syntax. Then the other, how can the child acquire, learn, whatever you want to call it, something semantics? You know, it's harder, you know, to acquire something through semantics and then project into syntax than to acquire from syntax and then by compositionality have it out in semantics. This is my perplexity.
Well, I, of course, strongly disagree. I think that it is possible, if we look at it carefully from this other perspective, to account for what goes on in syntax without having an autonomous syntax. I think it's possible to account for example, for things like referential conditions based on syntactic structure, like condition C of the binding theory, if you look at the semantics of things properly. And how, see, what we have to keep in mind is that every time there's something semantic, there's a form associated with it. And what puts the form and the meaning together is signs, either unitary signs, words, or combinatorial signs, and that's syntax. And I'll talk about combinatorial signs a lot in my talk tomorrow. Now, it's very, very often forgotten that syntax always operates on two levels. It puts together things that operate on two levels. It puts together signs, and signs always have two aspects of them. They have a conceptual aspect and they have a form aspect. Okay? And because of that, if you take the elements from these two sides of the coin and you see what their effects are on what we see as autonomous syntax, eventually we see that syntax is never actually autonomous. Now this, I mean, you made an assertion and a lot of people share that assertion. I just made a strong one, and of course it has to be defended. But that's the game we have to play. That's what we have to show. And I don't think that it's simply by assuming that we can't find an explanation for it immediately that it means that it's the case. That has been too long the method, I think, regarding UG. I was always troubled with the idea that how do you find something from UG? Okay. Well, over the years, the methodology was more or less like this: you look at some data, and then if you don't find an explanation immediately for it, you stop looking because you say, I just found something that shows that we need something innate, and we were then. This is a generic we, very happy because we said we've just demonstrated that, innate systems are needed because we didn't find an explanation here. That always troubled me. How strongly did we look for an explanation? Okay. I don't rejoice in not finding an explanation. I don't think it's a good method. And there's a high risk there. And what I'm trying to do by solving UG is really that gut feeling I've had for 30 years that we should get rid of that method of working.
So, of course, the argument is incomplete. There's many cases where you see that structure dependency and embeddedness, just to say it in another word, gives you things like consider only the formal property of it that the semantics cannot give you, scope ambiguities, condition A and B of the binding theory when applied in embedded context, and so many much more things. So the ball, as we say, should be in your path, right?
I fully agree, and I've picked up the ball for many years.
Not only theoretically and empirically, but also all these results that come from neuroscience, trying to pinpoint exactly, having some kind of independent evidence about how human brain works and how much hierarchy contributes to what a human can do with language as opposed to other beings, which are also telling. But I think that putting that aside, there is enough theoretical and empirical evidence to show that embeddedness and structure dependency is a key. So we're looking at things that are constant through expressions and through language. And I think that it's a very nice formal property of human language.
You have to distinguish two things. I'm not saying that there's no structure in language. Okay? I'm saying that there are no structure-dependent rules in language, which is a very different issue. Okay?
I mean, binding theory viewed as movement, any principles that appeal to structure, which is a complex structure, right? Not just, I mean, linear order is an asymmetrical relation, it's a simple one. But hierarchical is a more complex, right, asymmetrical relation. So what you want to say, in fact, is that it's enough if you have the first kind of asymmetry, right? Linear order is what counts for semantics. So
No, I'm sorry, something was missing. I did not say that we have to replace structure dependence by linear dependence. I said that we have to replace both of these by something that is more semantic. Okay? I don't depend on linear dependence. As far as all the other elements that depend on structure that have been analyzed as depending on structure, like binding conditions, which you mentioned, I've already wrote on that to show that indeed, to complete the argument, I fully agree. We have to deal with those, and it can be done. See, what I've just done as an exercise is take the stellar case of structure dependence and shown that It doesn't work for conceptual reasons. It's very incomplete. We need a lot of more stuff. And what we have to add, unfortunately, is also extremely unmotivated, unprincipled. Okay? So that weakens it on that side. And I've shown that on the empirical side, it doesn't work either. I mean, it tells you how to do things, but it doesn't prevent you from doing a lot of wrong things, like inverting the order of a sentence. Okay? So what I wanted to do with that is to raise a little flag of caution and say, let's be careful here. Let's look at our analyses in detail, because if the stellar case doesn't work, what are we going to do with the others? Okay? And I've done work over 30 years on a lot of the others, and a lot of other people have, and I think that we do find results there that can be explained strictly on independently motivated elements. Independently motivated being elements which we agree exist. That is, elements of cognition and meaning which we agree exist, and elements of the perceptual forms which we agree exist. And if you look at what these elements contain carefully, and you look at the effects they have, then you don't need things like, for example, computational processing conditions, okay, which in any event are doubtful in the following general sense. Okay? We're dealing with a biological organism here, okay? One of its functions, language. What is computational processing that's ideal for a biological organism? Is it the simplest, most economical system that is the most efficient one for a biological organism? We know the answer is no. A biological organism to function efficiently, okay, is not based on simplicity. It's based on redundancy, because that gives it robustness, so that whenever it encounters some unusual factor, it can continue functioning. It's not blocked because it's too fixed on one thing. That's the first aspect of things. The second aspect of having redundancy and robustness is that it gives you these free elements, let's say in the genetic part of the organism, so that these elements can drift and they will give us diversity. And that is what we get in biological organisms. So the notion of efficiency, we have to be very careful about. There's a notion of efficiency in how do I write my theory, okay? So if I see an organism that does strange things and that are redundant and all that, I'll describe that redundancy, but my theory has to be simple and, you know, following the general principles of science and so on. But these are two totally different domains, okay? The element we're looking at here is not the theory that deals with the thing. We're first, before looking at the theory, looking at what's actually going on. And the kind of efficiency that's going on there is not one of simplicity and elegance. That's at the level of the science describing what's going on. But the organism itself is functioning in a very redundant way, as language is, right? If I say in French, la petite chatte, I just told you 3 times that this thing is feminine. If I tell you nous marchons, I just told you twice that this is first person plural, and so on, and so on. Okay? The language is full of redundancy. Why? That gives it robustness. Okay? Now, the theory that accounts for the agreement, I will want to be extremely simple and elegant. Okay? But the fact, however, is full of redundancies. Yes?
Okay, I guess I don't have any general sense of I don't have any general sense, but I do have some technical sense. That is that for the traditional syntactic program, it's something that we can actually pin down with natural implements, we can actually work out mechanics. I don't see anything in your program that would allow me, for computer science, to do so. And that's something I think you really need to take up quite seriously. You can promise evolutionary inadequacy, but before you do that, I think the descriptive and explanatory adequacy have to come first.
I'll talk about that tomorrow. Again, yes, it's a broad program. I fully agree. And